You people are thieves! I've seen your kind before, so get out of here now!
He's just a kid.
TSA agent breaks black boy's leg until his sister's call to so dad shuts down entire airline, and what happened in those horrifying minutes at airport security will make you question everything you thought you knew about who's really keeping us safe. These tickets are fraudulent, probably stolen, TSA Officer Brandt announced loud enough for the entire security checkpoint to hear, his eyes moving slowly over 12-year-old Caleb and 14-year-old Destiny with the kind of cold assessment that said he'd already decided they were criminals before they'd even opened their mouths. "You smell something?" he muttered to his colleague, who let out a short laugh that cut through the busy terminal like a knife. The words hit Caleb first, confusion flooding his face because their dad had bought those tickets weeks ago, had printed them out carefully, had made sure everything was perfect for their trip to see Grandma for her 80th birthday. Then the accusation hit Destiny, her older sister instincts kicking in even as her hands started shaking, because she knew what was happening, recognized the tone and the assumptions and the danger of being young and black and accused by someone in uniform who held all the power. Now, before you tell yourself this kind of blatant racial profiling doesn't happen anymore at major airports with cameras everywhere and TSA oversight, before you convince yourself that surely trained federal agents wouldn't target children based on nothing but skin color, let me destroy that comfortable delusion right now. This happened 6 months ago in one of the busiest airports in America, captured on multiple security cameras, witnessed by hundreds of travelers, and it's not an isolated incident but part of a pattern so pervasive that black families have entire conversations with their children about how to survive encounters with airport security. The racism didn't die after the civil rights movement, it just learned to wear a badge and hide behind claims of following protocol. Destiny looked at Officer Brandt with eyes that had seen this coming even before they'd stepped into his security lane, had felt her stomach tighten the moment she'd noticed him watching them, had recognized the particular way his gaze had hardened when he'd seen two well-dressed black children with first-class tickets. She wasn't surprised by his accusation, wasn't shocked by his contempt, because this wasn't her first time being followed in stores or questioned about belongings she'd paid for or treated like a threat by adults who should have protected her, but the fear was real anyway, the powerlessness was crushing anyway, because knowing racism exists doesn't make you immune to its violence. "Sir, our dad bought those tickets," Caleb had said, his 12-year-old voice trying so hard to stay respectful, trying to follow all the rules their parents had drilled into them about staying calm and being polite and never giving them an excuse. "They're real, we can show you the confirmation email." But Brandt didn't want to see emails or confirmations or any evidence that would contradict the narrative he'd already constructed in his racist mind. He just snatched their printed tickets, turned them over once with theatrical suspicion, and handed them back with such contempt that other passengers in line had started paying attention, had started pulling out phones, had started witnessing what none of them would actually interrupt. "Step aside," Brandt had commanded, and those two words contained everything wrong with how power works in America, how authority can be weaponized against the vulnerable, how two children on their way to their grandmother's birthday party could suddenly find themselves trapped in a TSA checkpoint with nowhere to run and no one coming to help. The security line behind them had slowed as people watched, some looking away uncomfortably, some recording on phones held at chest level like documentation was the same as intervention, some shaking their heads but saying nothing, doing nothing, choosing the comfort of not getting involved over the courage of protecting children being publicly humiliated by a federal agent drunk on his own authority. For several agonizing minutes Brandt had kept them standing there at the edge of the checkpoint, no chairs offered, no explanation given, no supervisor called, just two black children being made to wait while white passengers moved through security freely, while their grandmother waited in Atlanta not knowing her grandchildren were being treated like criminals. While the clock ticked toward a flight they might miss because a TSA agent couldn't tolerate their existence in a space he'd decided didn't belong to them. Caleb had shifted his weight nervously, his 12-year-old body not built for standing perfectly still under the hostile gaze of an adult who hated him, and that small movement, that tiny attempt to ease the strain in his legs, had triggered what came next. And what came next would leave a child broken on a cold airport floor while his sister screamed for help that wouldn't arrive fast enough. If you believe no child should ever be brutalized by the very people supposed to keep them safe, keep watching, because what this TSA agent does in the next 60 seconds will make your blood boil. If you think airport racial profiling is exaggerated or rare, you need to see the security footage that's about to play out. And if you've ever been treated like a criminal because of your skin color, drop a comment below. Tell us your story, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is. We're reading every single one. This story doesn't end the way you think. Hit that like button if you stand against racism. Subscribe to this channel because we're exposing the incidents that federal agencies pray you'll never see. And trust me, what happens when their CEO father finds out will shake an entire industry. But to understand how 2 children ended up being treated like suspects at a TSA checkpoint, how a 12-year-old boy and his 14-year-old sister became targets of federal agent racism, we need to go back 48 hours to when this trip was supposed to be nothing but celebration and family joy, back to when Caleb and Destiny's biggest concern was choosing the perfect gift for their grandmother's milestone birthday. Caleb Collins was 12 years old, a 7th grader at Riverside Academy where he played trumpet in the school band and spent his free time building elaborate Lego structures that filled half his bedroom. He was gentle and thoughtful, the kid who brought home stray cats and cried during sad movies, the younger brother who looked up to Destiny with a kind of uncomplicated adoration that made her fiercely protective of him. He loved science and music and basketball even though he wasn't particularly good at it, loved his grandmother's sweet potato pie and the way she always had butterscotch candies in her purse, loved the stories she told about growing up in the segregated South and surviving things that would have broken weaker people. Destiny was 14, a freshman honor student who'd inherited her father's sharp mind and her late mother's gentle spirit, a girl who kept her grades perfect and her room organized and her little brother safe from the casual cruelties of middle school bullies. She was mature beyond her years, had been since their mother died of breast cancer 3 years ago, had stepped into a caretaker role she was too young for but handled with grace that made her father's heart break and swell in equal measure. She loved reading and debate team and protecting Caleb from a world that she was learning didn't always protect black children the way it should. Their father Warren Collins had raised them alone since losing his wife, had built his career at Collins Aviation Logistics into something remarkable while somehow never missing a parent-teacher conference or a band concert or a moment that mattered to his children. He was the CEO of one of the country's largest aviation logistics firms, a company that coordinated cargo and passenger operations for dozens of airlines, a man whose phone calls got returned by people who ran airports and airlines and federal transportation departments. But Caleb and Destiny didn't fully grasp the scope of their father's influence, didn't understand that when he made a business call people jumped, didn't realize that the big company Daddy runs employed over 15,000 people and generated billions in annual revenue. To them he was just Dad, the man who made pancakes on Saturday mornings and helped with homework at night and worked too much but always made time for what mattered, the father who'd held them through their grief when Mama died and taught them that strength wasn't about not crying but about getting back up after the tears dried. 2 days before the trip, Warren had surprised them with the tickets over dinner, had handed Destiny the printed confirmations with a smile that said he'd been planning this for weeks. "Your grandmother is turning 80, he'd said, his voice warm with the kind of love that transcended generations, and she wants nothing more than to see her grandbabies, so you two are flying to Atlanta to spend the weekend with her. First-class tickets, direct flight, you'll land in time for her birthday dinner." Caleb had lit up like Christmas morning, had started rattling off all the things he wanted to do with Grandma, all the stories he wanted to hear, all the pie he wanted to eat. Destiny had been more reserved but her eyes had shown the same excitement, the same anticipation of a weekend away from responsibility, of being grandchildren instead of miniature adults managing grief and homework and the weight of growing up too fast. Warren had spent the evening going over logistics with Destiny because she was the responsible one, the planner, the girl who would make sure her little brother stayed on schedule and didn't lose anything important. He'd reviewed their flight times and gate numbers, had made sure they had their IDs and boarding passes and the credit card he'd given Destiny for emergencies, had reminded them to stay together and call him if anything felt wrong, if anyone made them uncomfortable, if they needed help with anything at all. "You're going to be fine," Warren had said, pulling both children into a hug that lasted longer than usual. "You're smart and prepared and Grandma will be so happy to see you. Just remember what we've talked about. Be polite to everyone. Keep your documents organized. Stay calm if anyone questions you, and call me immediately if there's any problem at all." The conversation had carried the weight of the talk, That conversation every black parent has with their children about navigating a world that sees their skin before their humanity, about staying safe in encounters with authority figures who might not see them as children deserving protection but as threats requiring containment. Warren had tried to keep it light, had tried not to scare them, but Destiny had understood the subtext, had recognized the fear underneath her father's careful instructions, had known that being young and black and traveling alone carried risks that white children never had to consider. That morning at the airport, Warren had walked them all the way to the security checkpoint even though he was already late for a critical board meeting, had hugged them both tight and reminded them one more time to call if anything felt wrong, anything at all. "I'm proud of you both," he'd said, watching them gather their bags and boarding passes. "You're going to have an amazing time with Grandma. Tell her I love her and I'll see you all next month for Thanksgiving." Caleb had waved back with that easy smile that came from never having experienced the world's cruelty firsthand, from trusting that airports were safe and authority figures were helpful and trips to see Grandma were supposed to be filled with nothing but joy. Destiny had waved too, but her smile had been more careful, more aware, because she'd already started noticing the way some adults looked at them, the way security personnel's eyes lingered on black families longer than white ones, the way assumptions got made before anyone even spoke. They'd made it through check-in without incident, had navigated the terminal with the confidence of children who'd been well prepared, had found their security checkpoint and joined the line with their tickets ready and their IDs out and everything organized exactly the way their father had taught them. The checkpoint had been busy with the usual morning rush, business travelers in suits rushing to make flights, families with young children struggling with strollers and car seats, college students with overstuffed backpacks heading back to campus. Officer Brandt had been manning lane 3, his heavy-set frame filling the space behind the podium where he checked documents, his expression already sour before Caleb and Destiny even reached him. He'd watched them approach with eyes that narrowed, with a body language that shifted from bored routine to alert suspicion, with the particular attention that black travelers recognize as the prelude to problems. When they'd stepped up to his podium with their tickets and IDs ready, with polite good mornings on their lips, with the innocent expectation that this would be quick and easy, Brandt had looked them over slowly, deliberately, his gaze traveling from their neat clothes to their organized documents to their young black faces, and something had hardened in his expression. Some decision had been made before a single word was exchanged. That's when he'd leaned toward his colleague, that's when he'd made his comment about smelling something, that's when he'd announced loud enough for everyone to hear that their tickets were fraudulent, probably stolen. That's when two children's excited trip to see their grandmother had transformed into a nightmare that would end with broken bones and federal charges and a father's fury that would shake the foundations of airport security across the country. But they didn't know that yet, didn't know that Brandt's racism would escalate from verbal harassment to physical violence, didn't know that in less than 10 minutes Caleb would be lying on a cold airport floor with a fractured leg while Destiny screamed for help that wouldn't come fast enough. Didn't know that their father's power would eventually bring consequences but not soon enough to prevent their trauma. They just knew that once again, someone was looking at their skin and seeing criminals instead of children, and once again they'd have to prove their humanity to someone who'd already decided they didn't deserve basic dignity. Brandt had snatched their tickets from Destiny's outstretched hand with enough force to make the 14-year-old flinch, his thick fingers handling the printed boarding passes like they were evidence at a crime scene, turning them over with theatrical scrutiny that had nothing to do with actual verification and everything to do with public humiliation. His eyes hadn't even focused on the text, hadn't bothered to read the flight number or departure time or the clearly printed names that matched the IDs Destiny held in her other trembling hand, because he didn't want facts that would contradict the narrative he'd already constructed in his racist imagination. "I don't believe you," Brandt had said, handing the tickets back with such contempt that Destiny had almost dropped them, his voice carrying across the security checkpoint loud enough that passengers 3 lanes over had turned to watch, "Step aside," and those 2 words had contained all the power dynamics of America distilled into one moment, a federal agent in uniform commanding children to move because their blackness offended him, because their presence in his checkpoint disrupted his worldview where black kids didn't fly first class to visit their grandmothers. The line behind them had slowed to a crawl as people watched, as phones came out held at waist level capturing video they'd later post with concerned captions but wouldn't use in the moment to intervene, as travelers made the instant calculation that getting involved might delay their own flights, might put them under Brandt's hostile scrutiny, might cost them something they weren't willing to pay to protect two black children they didn't know. A middle-aged white woman had actually tooted in annoyance, irritated that this scene was holding up the line, irritated that these children and their drama were inconveniencing her tight connection, never once considering that maybe the uniformed adult was the problem. "Sir, please," Destiny had tried again, her voice shaking now but still maintaining the composure her father had drilled into her, still following the rules about staying calm and being respectful even when respect wasn't being returned. "We have the confirmation email on my phone, we can show you our father's credit card statement, we can call him right now to verify everything. Just please let us explain." But Brandt hadn't wanted explanations or evidence or anything that would force him to admit he'd made a racist assumption. He'd wanted compliance, wanted these black children to understand that he held all the power and they had none, wanted them to feel the full weight of his authority crushing down on their young shoulders. "Step aside," he'd repeated, his hand gesturing toward a small area near the wall where they'd be visible to everyone passing through security, where their humiliation would be as public as possible. "Move out of the line now or I'll have you removed from the airport entirely." Caleb had looked up at his sister with eyes that were starting to fill with tears, his 12-year-old brain struggling to process why this was happening, why a man whose job was to keep people safe was treating them like criminals, why having the right tickets and the right IDs and doing everything right still wasn't enough to protect them from hatred wearing a badge. Destiny had taken his hand and led him to where Brandt pointed, had kept her head high even though she felt like crying too, had squeezed Caleb's fingers and whispered it's going to be okay even though she had no idea if that was true. For the next several agonizing minutes they'd stood against that wall watching other passengers flow through security, watching white families get waved through with barely a glance at their documents, watching business travelers move efficiently from checkpoint to gate while Caleb and Destiny remained frozen in place like exhibits in a museum of injustice. No chairs had been offered for them to sit, no explanation given for why they were being detained, no supervisor called to review the situation, just two children standing under fluorescent lights being stared at by hundreds of strangers who decided their comfort mattered more than these kids' dignity. Brandt had returned to his podium and continued processing passengers like nothing was wrong, like he hadn't just publicly accused children of theft, like detaining minors without cause was just another Tuesday morning at the TSA checkpoint. His colleague, a younger white man with a thin mustache who'd laughed at Brandt's initial comment, kept glancing over at Caleb and Destiny with a smirk that suggested he was enjoying their discomfort, that their suffering was entertainment, that black children being put in their place was something to smile about. A black woman in her 50s had come through Brandt's lane and noticed the children standing there, had seen something in Destiny's face that triggered recognition of shared experience, of knowing exactly what was happening because it had probably happened to her too. She'd paused after getting her bag from the conveyor belt, had looked like she might say something, might ask if they were okay or offer to help, but then Brandt had cleared his throat meaningfully and the woman had hurried on, had chosen safety over solidarity, had made the calculation that intervening might make her the next target and she had her own flight to catch, her own life to protect. Caleb had shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his legs starting to ache from standing still, his 12-year-old body not designed for this kind of prolonged frozen attention. The movement had been tiny, barely noticeable, just a slight repositioning to ease the strain in his calves, but Brandt had noticed immediately, had looked over with eyes that gleamed with the anticipation of having found an excuse for further cruelty. "Stay still," Brandt had barked across the checkpoint, his voice sharp enough to make Caleb freeze mid-motion. "I told you to stand there and wait, that means don't move, do you understand me?" "Yes, sir," Caleb had whispered, his voice small and frightened, tears now openly streaming down his face because he was 12 and scared and his legs hurt and he wanted his dad, wanted to be anywhere but here, wanted this nightmare to end. Destiny had put her arm around her brother's shoulders, had felt him trembling against her, had wanted to scream at Brandt that he was terrorizing a child, that whatever power trip he was on wasn't worth traumatizing a 12-year-old boy who'd done nothing wrong. But she'd stayed quiet because she knew that black girls who talked back to authority figures got labeled as aggressive, got treated as threats, got their righteous anger used as justification for whatever violence came next. Other TSA agents had walked past, had seen two black children standing against the wall with tears streaming down their faces, had noticed Brandt's hostile attention focused on them, had made the choice to keep walking, to not question their colleague, to maintain the blue wall of silence that protected bad actors and abandoned vulnerable victims. A female agent had actually made eye contact with Destiny, had seen the plea in the 14-year-old's eyes, had looked away and kept moving because asking questions might create conflict, might make waves, might threaten the comfortable assumption that if Brandt had detained them there must be a good reason. The minutes had crawled by like hours, each second of standing there under hostile observation feeling like an eternity, each moment of public humiliation carving deeper wounds that would take years to heal. Caleb's legs had started shaking from the strain of standing perfectly still, from the adrenaline and fear coursing through his young body, from the desperate need to move that he was trying so hard to suppress because the man with the badge had told him to stay still. And that's when his 12-year-old body had betrayed him, when his aching legs had demanded relief, when he'd taken one small step to reposition his weight and restore circulation to feet that were starting to go numb, one tiny movement that would trigger a cascade of violence that would shatter bone and childhood innocence in equal measure. Brandt had seen the movement from across the checkpoint, had watched Caleb's small attempt to shift his weight like a predator watching prey make a mistake, and his face had transformed from cold authority into something uglier, something that looked almost pleased to have found justification for what he'd been wanting to do since the moment these black children had stepped into his lane. "I said stay still," he'd shouted, abandoning his podium and striding toward them with heavy steps that echoed across the tile floor. "What part of don't move do you not understand?" Caleb had frozen completely, his body rigid with terror, his 12-year-old mind trying to process what he'd done wrong, trying to understand why shifting his weight to keep his legs from cramping was somehow a crime worthy of this aggressive response. "I'm sorry, sir," he'd stammered, his voice breaking on the words. "My legs were hurting, I didn't mean to, I was just trying to." But Brandt hadn't wanted explanations or apologies, hadn't wanted anything except an excuse to escalate, to transform verbal harassment into physical control, to teach these black children a lesson about respecting his authority that they'd never forget. He'd moved into Caleb's personal space, had used his adult size to loom over a child who barely came up to his chest, had created the kind of physical intimidation that would look like nothing on camera but felt like violence to the 12-year-old experiencing it. Destiny had stepped slightly in front of her brother, her 14-year-old protective instincts overriding her fear, her body language saying without words that if Brandt wanted to hurt Caleb he'd have to go through her first. "So we're not trying to cause problems," she'd said, her voice surprisingly steady given that her heart was hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. "We're just waiting like you told us to. Please, we just want to catch our flight to see our grandmother." The mention of their grandmother, of the innocent family purpose behind their travel, should have softened something in Brandt's expression, should have reminded him that these were children on their way to a birthday celebration, should have triggered some basic human empathy. Instead his jaw had tightened, his eyes had hardened further, because in his worldview black families didn't have grandmothers they visited for birthdays, didn't have normal loving relationships, didn't deserve the benefit of doubt that he'd automatically extend to white children telling the same story. "You'll catch your flight when I say you can catch your flight," Brandt had said, his face now close enough to Destiny's that she could smell his coffee breath. "Right now you're detained pending verification of your travel documents, and if you keep talking back to me I'll add obstruction to the charges." Charges? The word had landed like a bomb because what charges could possibly exist against two children who'd done nothing wrong, who had legitimate tickets and valid IDs and were guilty of nothing except being black in a space where a racist TSA agent had decided they didn't belong. Destiny had felt her carefully maintained composure starting to crack, had felt hot tears building behind her eyes even though she was determined not to cry, not to give Brandt the satisfaction of seeing her break. Around them the checkpoint had continued its normal operations, passengers moving through security in steady streams, TSA agents checking bags and scanning IDs and waving people along, the whole apparatus of airport security functioning smoothly everywhere except in this one corner where two black children stood being terrorized by a federal agent while hundreds of witnesses chose blindness over intervention. A family with 3 young kids had walked past, the mother glancing over with concern before her husband had touched her elbow and shaken his head, a silent communication that said don't get involved, not our problem, keep moving. The automated announcements had continued playing overhead, reminding travelers to keep belongings with them at all times, warning about unattended bags, cheerfully listing departure gates and boarding times, the pleasant recorded voice creating a surreal contrast to the nightmare unfolding below. Somewhere in this airport their flight to Atlanta was being prepared, the gate agents were processing early boarders, the plane was being fueled and loaded, and Caleb and Destiny were supposed to be walking toward that gate excited about seeing Grandma, not standing against a wall being treated like criminals. Caleb's legs had continued to shake, the muscles fatigued from standing frozen for so long, from the adrenaline coursing through his system, from the fear that had every nerve ending in his young body firing distress signals. He'd tried so hard to stay perfectly still like Brant had commanded, had tried to be good and compliant and everything their father had taught them about surviving encounters with hostile authority, but 12-year-old bodies aren't designed for that kind of sustained immobility, especially not under the stress of being publicly humiliated and threatened. His left leg had started to cramp, a sharp pain shooting from his calf up through his thigh, and without conscious thought, operating purely on the body's instinct to avoid pain, Caleb had taken a small step forward to stretch the muscle, to relieve the cramping before it got worse. One tiny movement that was completely involuntary and completely innocent and completely catastrophic. Brant had been waiting for it, had been watching for any excuse, had been looking for justification to do what he'd wanted to do from the moment he'd decided these black children needed to be taught a lesson about their place in his America. The instant Caleb's foot had moved, Brant's boot had lashed out with shocking speed, catching the boy's leg just below the knee with enough force that the impact had echoed across the checkpoint, with enough violence that there was no possible way to claim it was accidental or necessary or anything other than deliberate assault. The sound of boot meeting bone had been distinct and terrible, a crack that made nearby passengers gasp and turn, that cut through the ambient noise of the busy terminal like a gunshot, that would later be clearly audible on the security camera footage that would be played in courtrooms and congressional hearings. Caleb's scream had followed immediately, a sound of pure agony that no child should ever make, a cry that conveyed shock and pain and betrayal in equal measure as his leg had given out beneath him and he'd collapsed to the cold tile floor. "Stop being dramatic," Brant had said, his voice flat and emotionless as he'd stood over the writhing child, his arms crossing over his chest in a posture of complete indifference to the suffering he'd just caused. "Get up, you're fine. Stop making a scene." But Caleb wasn't fine, wasn't being dramatic, couldn't get up because his leg was broken, because the bone officer Brant had kicked with his steel-toed boot was fractured, because the pain was so intense that the 12-year-old couldn't even catch his breath to scream anymore, could only lie there clutching his leg and making small wounded sounds that broke his sister's heart into pieces too small to ever fully repair. Destiny had dropped to her knees beside her brother, her hands hovering over him wanting to help but not knowing how, not knowing if touching him would make the pain worse, not knowing what to do except scream for help that seemed impossibly far away. "Somebody help us," she'd cried, her voice cracking with panic and grief. "Please somebody call an ambulance, he's hurt, he needs help, please." People had finally turned then, had finally stopped pretending not to see, had finally looked at what was happening with expressions ranging from shock to horror to uncomfortable guilt. A few had gasped audibly, hands flying to mouths, eyes widening as they'd processed the scene of a child on the ground in obvious agony while a TSA agent stood over him unmoved. But still nobody had moved fast enough, nobody had run to help, nobody had immediately intervened to protect a suffering child from the adult who'd just assaulted him. And if you're watching this and you're not already outraged enough to slam that subscribe button, if you're not hitting like and sharing this story with everyone you know, then ask yourself what it says about you that a 12-year-old child can be brutalized by a federal agent while hundreds of people watch and do nothing. Subscribe right now because stories like Caleb's need to be told and amplified and used to demand change. Because your silence makes you complicit and your engagement makes you part of the solution. Brant had stood over Caleb's crumpled form with arms still crossed, his face showing no remorse or concern or even basic human recognition that he'd just injured a child. Instead his expression carried irritation at the disruption, annoyance that this boy was making noise and drawing attention, contempt for what he clearly believed was theatrical performance designed to make him look bad. "He's faking," Brant had announced to the gathering crowd, his voice loud and certain, projecting the authority of his uniform to override the evidence of their own eyes. "These kids are trying to create a scene to avoid legitimate security screening. I barely touched him." But the people close enough to have heard the crack of boot against bone knew better. had heard the sickening impact that couldn't be faked, had seen the unnatural angle of Caleb's leg as he'd fallen, had watched a 12-year-old child's face transform from fear to shock to agony in the span of a heartbeat. A businessman in an expensive suit had pulled out his phone and started recording with shaking hands, his face pale because he'd just witnessed assault, had just watched a federal agent deliberately kick a child, had just become a witness to something he couldn't unsee or unknow. Caleb had continued making those small wounded sounds, his hands clutching his leg above where Brant's boot had connected, his body curled into itself seeking relief from pain that wasn't going away, that was building in waves that made his vision blur and his stomach churn with nausea. The tears streaming down his face weren't the frustrated tears of earlier embarrassment but the helpless tears of genuine physical trauma, of hurt so intense his 12-year-old brain couldn't process it, of betrayal so deep he couldn't understand why the adult who was supposed to keep him safe had instead broken him. Destiny had looked up from where she knelt beside her brother with a face that showed pure devastation, her 14-year-old composure completely shattered, her eyes wild with panic and fury and helplessness all fighting for dominance. "You hurt him," she'd sobbed at Brant, her voice raw and breaking. "He's 12 years old and you hurt him. What's wrong with you? Why would you do this?" A woman in scrubs, probably a nurse or doctor traveling for work, had pushed through the growing crowd and dropped to her knees on Caleb's other side, her trained hands already assessing the injury with gentle efficiency. "Don't move, sweetheart," she'd said softly to Caleb. "I'm a nurse and I need to look at your leg, okay? I know it hurts, but I need you to try to stay still for me." She'd carefully examined where Brant's boot had struck, her fingers probing with practiced care, and her face had gone grim as she'd felt what was clearly a fracture, as she'd seen the swelling already beginning, as she'd recognized that this child needed immediate medical attention. "This leg is broken," she'd said loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, turning to glare at Brant with unconcealed disgust. "This child has a fractured tibia and possibly fibula. He needs an ambulance now, and whoever did this needs to be arrested." Brant's expression had flickered then, some crack appearing in his wall of indifference as the reality of what he'd done started to penetrate, as the word arrested had registered, as he'd perhaps begun to realize that kicking a child hard enough to break bone might carry consequences even for a TSA agent. He'd opened his mouth to respond, but another voice had cut through the chaos. A TSA supervisor who'd finally appeared after being alerted by other agents that something was very wrong at checkpoint 3. "What happened here?" the supervisor had demanded, a middle-aged black woman whose name tag read Williams and whose face showed the exhausted frustration of someone who'd dealt with too many incidents like this, who'd cleaned up after too many colleagues who let their prejudices override their training. "Who's done this?" Multiple voices had answered at once, passengers pointing at Brant, the nurse explaining the injury, Destiny sobbing that the officer had kicked her brother, the whole story tumbling out in overlapping testimonies that painted a clear picture of assault witnessed by dozens of people captured on multiple phones and security cameras. Supervisor Williams had looked at Brant with an expression that said she wasn't surprised, that she'd probably suspected this man was a problem long before today, that she was tired of wearing the same uniform as people who used it as a license for cruelty. "Someone call 911, Williams had ordered, her voice carrying command authority that Brant had wielded earlier but with actual legitimacy behind it. "Get paramedics here immediately, and someone get me the airport police. This is now a criminal matter." Destiny had pulled out her phone with hands that shook so badly she almost dropped it, her finger hovering over her father's contact, knowing that calling him would unleash something powerful but also knowing that Caleb needed help now, needed their dad's voice and presence and ability to make things happen when systems failed. The nurse had continued her assessment, had used someone's jacket as a pillow for Caleb's head, had kept up a steady stream of gentle reassurance while the boy whimpered and clutched at Destiny's hand like it was the only solid thing in a world that had tilted sideways. Brant had started backing away, had begun formulating excuses, had pulled out his own incident report pad like documentation could save him, like writing his version first would somehow override the video evidence and witness testimony, like he could still control this narrative the way he'd controlled the interaction from the beginning. The boy moved suddenly. He'd started saying to Supervisor Williams, "I gave a lawful command to remain stationary and he's 12, Williams had interrupted, her voice cold with disgust. "He's a child who'd been standing there for 10 minutes because you decided to detain him without cause. and now he has a broken leg because you kicked him. Save your report for the police because you're done here. The checkpoint had ground to a complete halt now. All the lanes stopped, hundreds of passengers backed up watching this drama unfold. This moment where the machinery of security had broken down to reveal the racism and violence it sometimes concealed beneath protocols and procedures. Some people were recording, some were calling their own family members to tell them what they'd witnessed, some were just standing in stunned silence trying to process that they'd watched a federal agent break a child's leg and then claim the child was faking. The paramedics had arrived within 6 minutes, their emergency bags clanging as they jogged through the checkpoint, passengers parting to let them through, and their faces had shown professional concern that deepened into anger when they'd seen a 12-year-old child lying on cold airport tile with a leg bent at an angle that bones shouldn't bend. "How long has he been down?" the lead paramedic had asked, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and efficient movements. "Who did this to him?" "That officer kicked him," the nurse in scrubs had reported immediately, pointing at Brandt, who was now standing 15 feet away pretending to write his incident report. "I'm a trauma nurse at Mercy Hospital and I witnessed the entire assault. That man kicked this child hard enough to fracture his tibia, probably his fibula too. This needs x-rays and possibly surgical intervention." The paramedic's jaw had tightened as she'd looked from Caleb's agonized face to Brandt's indifferent posture, her hands already working to stabilize the leg, to prepare for transport, to provide what relief she could to a child who'd been failed by every adult who was supposed to protect him. "Sweetheart, I'm going to give you something for the pain," she'd said gently to Caleb, her voice the first truly compassionate thing he'd heard since this nightmare began. "It's going to be okay, we're going to take good care of you." Caleb had nodded through his tears, his face pale and sweaty with shock, his breathing shallow and rapid, his whole body trembling with pain and fear and the aftermath of adrenaline that had nowhere to go. Destiny had stayed pressed against his side, one hand gripping his, the other clutching her phone like a lifeline, still debating whether to call their father now or wait until they were at the hospital, still trying to process that her little brother was broken on an airport floor because a TSA agent had decided their blackness was criminal. The second paramedic had pulled out an inflatable splint, had worked with his partner to carefully immobilize Caleb's leg, and every movement, no matter how gentle, had made the boy whimper with fresh pain, had made Destiny's tears fall harder, had made the gathered crowd shift uncomfortably with the collective guilt of having watched this happen without stopping it. A few passengers had approached Supervisor Williams offering to give statements, offering their video footage, offering belated help now that the violence was over and the child was already broken. Brandt had continued his charade of writing a report, his pen moving across the page in what he probably thought looked official and necessary, crafting a narrative where a dangerous minor had resisted lawful commands and sustained an injury during necessary restraint, where his boot hadn't deliberately struck bone but had perhaps accidentally made contact during a justified use of force. He'd glanced up occasionally at the scene around him, at the paramedics working on Caleb, at Supervisor Williams coordinating with airport police who were now arriving, at the dozens of phones pointed in his direction capturing every moment of his downfall. "You're going to need to come with us," an airport police officer had said to Brandt, a young black man whose face showed barely contained rage at what his eyes were telling him had happened here. "We have some questions about this incident." "I was performing my duties," Brandt had protested, his voice taking on a defensive edge. "That minor was non-compliant with security screening procedures. I used appropriate force to maintain order and he fell during the encounter. This is being blown completely out of proportion." "He didn't fall," multiple voices had said at once, witnesses stepping forward with their phones extended showing clear footage of Brandt's boot connecting with Caleb's leg, showing the deliberate violence, showing the lie dying before it could even take root. "You kicked him, we all saw it. We have it on video." The paramedics had lifted Caleb onto a stretcher with movements so careful they still made him cry out, had strapped him in securely, had started in 4-line to deliver pain medication that would hopefully dull the worst of his suffering. Destiny had grabbed both their backpacks, had stuffed their boarding passes and IDs into her pockets with shaking hands, had followed the stretcher as they'd begun wheeling her brother toward the terminal exit where an ambulance waited. "Wait," she'd said suddenly, her voice breaking through the controlled chaos, stopping the paramedics mid-stride. "I need to call our dad. He needs to know what happened. He told us to call if anything went wrong." The lead paramedic had nodded understanding, had paused the stretcher, had given this 14-year-old girl a moment to make the call that would change everything, that would transform this from a local incident into a corporate crisis, that would prove that the two children Brandt had dismissed as nobodies had a father whose name opened doors and ended careers. Destiny had pulled out her phone with fingers that barely functioned, had scrolled to Dad and pressed call, had held the device to her ear while her free hand gripped Caleb's, while her brother whimpered on a stretcher surrounded by strangers, while their trip to Grandma's birthday had dissolved into a nightmare of broken bones and shattered innocence. The phone had rung once and Warren Collins had answered, his voice warm and slightly distracted because he'd been in a meeting, because he'd assumed his children were safely on a plane by now, because he'd had no reason to expect the call that was about to stop his heart. "Hey baby girl," he'd said, "everything okay? You guys boarding soon?" "Daddy," Destiny had sobbed, and that single word carried enough pain and fear that Warren had immediately stood up from his conference table, had waved his executive silent, had moved toward the door with his entire focus narrowing to his daughter's voice. "Daddy, they hurt Caleb. A TSA agent kicked him and his leg is broken and we're going to the hospital and I didn't know what to do." Silence on the other end for exactly 2 seconds while Warren's brain processed words that didn't make sense, that couldn't be real, that violated every assumption he'd made about his children being safe in a busy airport surrounded by federal agents whose job was protection, not violence. Then his voice had come back transformed, no longer the warm dad voice but something cold and controlled and carrying the weight of power about to be unleashed. "Where are you right now?" Warren had asked, his words clipped and precise. "Which airport? Which hospital are they taking him to? Is Destiny with you?" "We're still at the checkpoint." Destiny had managed through her tears. "They're loading him into an ambulance. I think we're going to County General. Daddy, he's crying and his leg looks wrong and that man just kicked him for no reason and nobody helped us." "Stay with your brother," Warren had commanded, his mind already 3 steps ahead making calculations and connections and decisions. "Don't talk to anyone except medical staff. Don't sign anything. Don't let them separate you. Daddy is coming right now and baby girl, that man who hurt Caleb is never going to hurt another child again. I promise you that." Warren had ended the call and stood frozen in his office for exactly 3 seconds, his phone still pressed to his ear, his daughter's sobs echoing in his memory like a physical wound, his brain struggling to reconcile the words she'd spoken with the safe world he'd believed he was sending his children into that morning. "A TSA agent kicked him," Destiny had said, and those 5 words had detonated something in Warren's chest, had transformed him from concerned father into something far more dangerous, a man with resources and connections and fury who was about to remind an entire industry exactly who they'd allowed their employee to assault. He turned to the 12 executives still seated around his conference table, their faces showing confusion at the sudden interruption, at their CEO's abrupt shift from discussing quarterly logistics projections to standing white-knuckled and trembling by the door. "Meeting's over," Warren had said, his voice flat and cold. "My son has been injured at airport security. I need this room cleared now," and he'd watched them gather their materials and file out quickly, responding to the command in his tone that said this wasn't negotiable, wasn't something to question or discuss. The moment the door had closed behind the last executive, Warren had made his first call, punching numbers from memory because this was a contact he'd never needed to save, had hoped he'd never need to use, the direct line to Gerald Thompson, who sat on the board of the airline that operated the hub where his children had been attacked. Gerald had answered on the 3rd ring, his voice jovial and unsuspecting. "Warren, good to hear from you. What can I do for you today?" "One of your TSA contractors just broke my 12-year-old son's leg," Warren had said without preamble, without softening the blow or easing into the conversation, "kicked him hard enough to fracture bone at a security checkpoint while my daughter watched. I need you to shut down that checkpoint immediately, secure all footage, and have that agent in police custody before I arrive at the airport in 25 minutes. The silence on Gerald's end had stretched for 5 full seconds, the sound of a man's brain trying to process information that contradicted everything he'd assumed about his morning, about his airline's operations, about the professional relationship he'd maintained with Warren Collins for the better part of a decade. "Warren, are you, is this?" Gerald had stammered, clearly struggling to formulate a response adequate to what he'd just heard. "I'm not asking," Warren had interrupted. his voice dropping to a register that executives who'd negotiated with him recognized as the tone he used right before destroying a competitor or walking away from a deal that wasn't meeting his terms. "I'm telling you what's going to happen. My son is on his way to County General with a fractured leg because your security contractor decided 2 black children with first-class tickets must be criminals. You have video evidence of the assault from multiple angles. You have dozens of witnesses, and in approximately 23 minutes I'm going to walk into that airport, and if that man is still wearing a badge, I'm going to make it my personal mission to ensure your airline never handles another Collins Aviation Logistics contract." The threat had been delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but Gerald had understood the weight behind it, had known that Warren's company coordinated cargo and passenger logistics for dozens of carriers, that losing that business would cost his airline hundreds of millions annually, that Warren Collins angry was a force that could reshape entire markets. "I'll make the calls right now," Gerald had said, his voice stripped of its earlier friendliness. "I'm so sorry, Warren. I'll handle this personally. I promise you that agent will be removed immediately." "Good," Warren had said, "and Gerald, I want you to understand something very clearly. This isn't about business leverage or contract negotiations. This is about my children, my 12-year-old son who was excited to visit his grandmother and is now in an ambulance with a broken leg, my 14-year-old daughter who had to watch her brother be assaulted by a federal agent while strangers filmed and did nothing. So when I say that man needs to be in custody, I mean he needs to be arrested, charged, prosecuted, and permanently banned from ever wearing a uniform again." The call had ended and Warren had immediately dialed his attorney, Marcus Chin, a man who specialized in civil rights litigation and had made a career of holding institutions accountable when they failed to protect the vulnerable. Marcus had picked up with his usual efficiency. "Warren, what's going on? Your assistant said it was urgent. I need you to meet me at County General Hospital emergency room," Warren had said while grabbing his jacket and keys, simultaneously heading toward his office door. "My son was assaulted by a TSA agent at the airport, broken leg, multiple witnesses, video evidence. I want every piece of footage secured, every witness statement documented, every protocol violation cataloged, and I want federal charges filed before the day ends." Marcus had shifted instantly into crisis mode, his voice taking on the focused intensity of a lawyer who'd handled enough of these cases to know exactly what needed to happen in the critical first hours. "I'm leaving now," he'd said. "I'll have my paralegals start pulling airport security policies and TSA use of force guidelines. We'll need medical records documenting the injury, witness contact information, and Warren, I'm sorry this happened to Caleb. Kids shouldn't have to experience this." Warren had made it to his car in under 2 minutes, had peeled out of the executive parking garage with enough speed that his tires had squealed against concrete, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white, his mind filled with images of Caleb lying on cold airport floor crying for help that came too slowly, of Destiny trying to protect her brother with nothing but her own 14-year-old body and voice, of all the ways he'd failed to keep his children safe from a world that saw their blackness before their humanity. The drive to the airport normally took 35 minutes in traffic, but Warren had made it in 19, running red lights and weaving through lanes with the kind of reckless urgency that comes when your child is hurt and every second of distance feels like abandonment. His phone had rung twice during the drive, Gerald calling back to confirm that Brandt had been removed from the checkpoint and airport police were detaining him, Marcus calling to say he'd diverted to the airport first to begin securing evidence and witness statements while everything was still fresh. Warren had barely registered the updates, his entire focus narrowed to getting to his children, to seeing with his own eyes that Caleb was being cared for, to wrapping Destiny in his arms and telling her she'd done everything right, that calling him was exactly what she should have done, that Daddy was here now and nobody was going to hurt them ever again. He'd abandoned his car in a fire lane outside the terminal entrance, had sprinted through automatic doors into the chaos of the checkpoint area which had been completely shut down, yellow caution tape blocking all the lanes, TSA agents standing around looking uncomfortable, travelers backed up in confused crowds asking what was happening. Warren had spotted Supervisor Williams immediately, had recognized authority in her bearing, had approached with his CO face firmly in place even though everything inside him was screaming father panic. "I'm Warren Collins," he'd said, his voice steady despite the hurricane of emotion underneath. "My children were assaulted here approximately 30 minutes ago. My son was transported to County General and I need to know exactly what happened and who's responsible. Williams had looked at him with an expression that mixed professional sympathy with genuine regret, had gestured toward a small office off to the side away from the crowds and cameras. Mr. Collins, I'm so sorry about what happened to your son, she'd said as they'd walked. I've already given statements to airport police and I want you to know that Officer Brandt has been removed from duty and is currently being questioned. What he did was completely unacceptable and violated every protocol we have. Warren had listened to Supervisor Williams recount the incident with a face carved from stone, his jaw clenching tighter with each detail about how Brandt had profiled his children, had accused them of theft, had detained them without cause, had kicked Caleb hard enough to fracture bone when the 12-year-old had simply tried to ease the strain in his aching legs. I want to see the footage, Warren had said when Williams finished, every camera angle, every second from when my children entered that checkpoint until the paramedics arrived. I want it secured and copied and I want it now. Williams had nodded and pulled up the security system on her computer, had queued up multiple camera angles showing the checkpoint from different perspectives, and Warren had watched his children's nightmare unfold in high-definition silence. He'd seen Caleb and Destiny approach Brandt's podium with their tickets ready, had seen the way the agent's expression had hardened the moment he'd looked at them, had watched his daughter try to show documentation while Brandt refused to even look, had seen his babies being humiliated in front of hundreds of strangers who just watched and filmed. Then he'd seen the kick, Brandt's boot connecting with Caleb's leg with force that was unmistakably deliberate, had watched his son collapse to the floor screaming, had seen Destiny drop beside him trying to help while Brandt stood there unmoved. Warren's hands had started shaking watching the footage, his breath coming shorter, his vision tunneling as rage and grief and paternal fury all fought for dominance in his chest. I need copies of all of this sent to my attorney immediately, Warren had said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion, and I need to know where Officer Brandt is right now because I want to look him in the eye before he's arrested. I want him to know exactly whose children he assaulted. Williams had hesitated, her professional training warring with her understanding that this father deserved answers, deserved confrontation, deserved something more than bureaucratic procedures. He's in an interrogation room with airport police, she'd said carefully. I'm not supposed to allow contact, but Mr. Collins, I watched what happened to your children, and if you need 5 minutes with that man, I can arrange for the cameras in that hallway to malfunction temporarily. Warren had looked at her with something approaching gratitude, this black woman who understood without words being spoken that sometimes fathers needed to stand between their children and the people who'd hurt them, who recognized that justice through proper channels was necessary but insufficient to heal the wound of watching your baby be broken. Show me where he is, Warren had said. They'd walked through corridors away from the public areas, past TSA offices and security stations, until Williams had stopped outside a door marked Interview Room C. He's in there, she'd said quietly. Airport police stepped out to review witness statements. You have maybe 3 minutes before they come back. I'll be at the end of the hall making sure nobody interrupts. Warren had opened the door to find Brandt sitting alone at a metal table, his uniform rumpled now, his earlier confidence replaced by the nervous energy of someone beginning to understand the magnitude of their mistake. Brandt had looked up when the door opened, his expression shifting from anxiety to confusion at seeing a well-dressed black man in an expensive suit instead of the police officers he'd been expecting. Who are you? Brandt had asked, his voice still carrying remnants of the authority he'd wielded at the checkpoint. You're not supposed to be in here. I'm Warren Collins, Warren had said quietly, closing the door behind him. So of Collins Aviation Logistics, and more importantly, I'm the father of the 2 children you assaulted less than an hour ago. I'm the man whose 12-year-old son is at County General getting x-rays on the leg you broke. The color had drained from Brandt's face as the pieces had connected, as he'd realized that the black children he'd dismissed as nobodies had a father who could end him, whose connections and resources and sheer power were about to rain down on his head like biblical judgment. It wasn't, Brandt had stammered. The boy was non-compliant and I used appropriate force to. You kicked a child, Warren had interrupted, his voice still quiet but carrying enough fury to make Brandt flinch back in his chair. You looked at my 12-year-old son and decided his blackness was criminal. You detained him without cause, you humiliated him in front of hundreds of people, and when his legs got tired from standing at attention like you'd commanded, you kicked him hard enough to fracture bone. Warren had leaned forward, his hands flat on the table, his face now close enough to Brant's that the agent could see the tears the father was fighting to hold back. My son was on his way to visit his grandmother for her 80th birthday, Warren had continued, his voice breaking slightly now. He was excited and happy and completely innocent, and you broke him because 23 years wearing a badge taught you that you could brutalize black children without consequences. Brant had tried to speak, had opened his mouth to offer some defense or excuse or apology, but Warren had held up a hand stopping him. I don't want to hear it, Warren had said. I've seen the footage from 6 different angles. I have statements from dozens of witnesses. I have medical documentation of my son's injuries, and I have resources you can't even imagine to ensure that what you did to Caleb follows you for the rest of your life. He'd straightened then, had adjusted his suit jacket, had wiped at his eyes before the tears could actually fall. You're going to be arrested today, Warren had said, his voice returning to that cold corporate tone. You're going to be charged with assault on a minor and civil rights violations. You're going to lose your job and your pension and any chance of ever working in security again. And every time you apply for employment for the rest of your life, you're going to have to explain why you kicked a 12-year-old child hard enough to break his leg. Warren had turned toward the door, had his hand on the knob when Brant finally found his voice. I have rights too, the agent had said, his words carrying a pathetic defiance. I was doing my job, protecting the airport. Those kids looked suspicious and Warren had turned back slowly, his expression showing something close to pity for this small, hateful man whose racism had destroyed his own future. You had rights, Warren had corrected, past tense. You had a career and a pension and presumably some respect in your community, but you traded all of that to hurt my children. You chose racism over humanity, and now you get to live with that choice in whatever job you can find after federal prison. The door had opened then and airport police had returned, had looked surprised to see Warren in the room but hadn't questioned it, had simply resumed their positions as Warren had walked out without another glance at Brant. Williams had been waiting at the end of the hall as promised, her face showing approval of whatever had just transpired in that room. Your attorney is at the hospital, she told Warren, and your daughter called asking when you'd be there. She's scared and she needs her dad. Warren had nodded, his brief satisfaction at confronting Brant evaporating in the face of his children's ongoing trauma. Thank you, he'd said to Williams, for securing the evidence and for those 3 minutes. Those children deserved better than what happened here today, Williams had replied, and between you and me, Mr. Collins, I've filed complaints about Brant's behavior toward black passengers for 3 years. Every report was ignored or dismissed. Maybe now someone will finally listen. Warren had arrived at County General to find Marcus already in the emergency room waiting area, his attorney's briefcase open with documents spread across 3 chairs, a paralegal typing furiously on a laptop capturing witness statements that were being called in from passengers who'd filmed the incident. Marcus had looked up when Warren approached, his expression showing the professional sympathy of someone who'd handled too many cases like this, who knew the statistics on how often black children were treated as threats by authority figures who should protect them. Destiny's in examination room 4 with Caleb, Marcus had reported, standing to grip Warren's shoulder. The orthopedic surgeon is reviewing x-rays now, looks like a clean fracture of the tibia, but they want to make sure there's no ligament damage before they decide if surgery is needed. Your daughter has been incredibly strong, but she needs you. Warren had moved toward the examination room on legs that felt unsteady, his hands trembling as he'd pushed through the door to find Destiny sitting in a plastic chair beside a hospital bed where Caleb lay with his leg elevated and wrapped in a temporary splint. Both children had looked up when he'd entered, and the relief on their faces had almost brought Warren to his knees, had shattered whatever composure he'd been maintaining through confrontations and phone calls and the drive across the city. Daddy, Destiny had sobbed, launching herself from the chair into his arms, her 14-year-old body shaking with tears she'd been holding back since the paramedics had loaded her brother into the ambulance. I tried to protect him, but that man just kicked him and nobody would help us, and I didn't know what to do. Warren had held his daughter tight, one hand stroking her hair while his eyes found Caleb on the bed, his son's face pale and tear-streaked, his leg immobilized but clearly still causing pain despite whatever medication they'd given him. You did everything right, baby girl, Warren had whispered into Destiny's hair. Calling me was exactly what you should have done. You were so brave and I'm so proud of you. He'd moved to Caleb's bedside then, had taken his son's hand carefully, had tried to smile through the rage and grief that seeing his child injured was triggering. Hey buddy, Warren had said softly. How you doing? They taking good care of you? It hurts, Daddy, Caleb had whispered, his 12-year-old voice small and broken in a way that made Warren's heart crack. That man kicked me and it hurts so bad and I don't understand why he did it. We had the right tickets. We were being good. Why did he hurt me? The question had hung in the air, carrying weight no father should have to address, no child should have to ask, the fundamental why of racism that had no good answer, no explanation that would make sense to a 12-year-old who'd been raised to believe that following rules and being polite would keep him safe. Warren had sat on the edge of the hospital bed, had gathered his son as carefully as the injuries allowed, had felt Caleb's tears soaking into his shirt. Because some people carry hate in their hearts, Warren had said quietly, trying to find words adequate to this terrible teaching moment, and when they have power they use it to hurt people who look like us. It's not fair and it's not right and it's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong, buddy. That man hurt you because of his hate, not because of anything you did. The orthopedic surgeon had entered then, a South Asian woman in her 50s whose badge read Dr. Patel, and her face had shown the kind of gentle competence that made frightened children feel safer. Caleb, she'd said, pulling up a stool beside the bed, I've looked at your x-rays and you have a fracture of your tibia. That's the big bone in your lower leg. The good news is it's a clean break, which means it should heal well. The less good news is you're going to need a cast for about 8 weeks and you'll be on crutches for most of that time. Will it heal all the way? Caleb had asked, his voice showing the fear every young athlete has about injuries that might limit their future. Will I be able to play basketball again? Dr. Patel had smiled warmly, had reached out to pat his hand. With proper care and physical therapy you should make a complete recovery, she'd said. Bones are actually quite good at healing, especially in young people. In 6 months you probably won't even remember which leg was broken. But he'll remember how it got broken, Warren had said quietly. He'll remember that a TSA agent kicked him hard enough to fracture bone because he decided a 12-year-old black child was a threat. Dr. Patel's expression had shifted to something harder, professional sympathy giving way to righteous anger. I've documented in my report that this injury is consistent with blunt force trauma from a boot strike, she'd said, and I'll testify to that in any legal proceeding. Children should never be treated this way. The process of getting Caleb's leg properly casted had taken another 2 hours, time filled with more x-rays and measurements and the careful application of fiberglass that would be his constant companion for the next 8 weeks. Warren had stayed beside his son through all of it, holding his hand, telling him stories, trying to distract from the discomfort and the trauma and the loss of the trip they'd been so excited about that morning. Destiny had stayed too, her presence a quiet support for her brother, her occasional tears testament to the fear she'd carried watching Caleb hurt and not knowing if help would arrive in time. The siblings had held hands across the hospital bed, these 2 kids who'd left home that morning excited about seeing Grandma and were now navigating the aftermath of violence that had shattered their innocence. When they'd finally been cleared to leave, Caleb on crutches that he was still learning to manage, Warren had carried both their backpacks and helped his son navigate the hospital corridors, Destiny walking close on his other side like she was afraid to let either of them out of her sight. Marcus had met them in the lobby with paperwork, medical records already copied and documented, witness statements compiled, video evidence secured from multiple sources. I've filed preliminary complaints with TSA, the airport authority, and the Justice Department, Marcus had reported as they'd walked toward Warren's car. Brandt has been formally arrested and charged with assault on a minor and civil rights violations. His colleague who laughed has been suspended pending investigation, and the supervisor who watched without intervening has been terminated. Good, Warren had said, helping Caleb into the back seat, making sure his casted leg was positioned comfortably. But that's just the beginning, Marcus. I want federal oversight of that entire checkpoint. I want every agent who was on duty that day interviewed about their training and their biases. I want systemic changes that ensure no other child goes through what Caleb experienced. 6 weeks later, Caleb had hobbled through his grandmother's front door in Atlanta on crutches that he'd decorated with stickers and motivational quotes, his cast covered in signatures from classmates and teachers who'd heard his story, his smile tentative but real when his grandmother had opened her arms and burst into tears at the sight of her grandbabies finally making it to her doorstep. They'd missed her 80th birthday party, but she'd insisted on a belated celebration, had baked Caleb's favorite sweet potato pie and Destiny's preferred lemon cake, had spent 3 days cooking all their favorite foods because feeding her grandchildren was how she showed love. "Oh my babies," she'd sobbed, holding them both as tightly as Caleb's injuries would allow, her 70-year-old hands shaking as she touched their faces like confirming they were real. "I'm so sorry for what happened to you. So sorry that man hurt you, but I'm so glad you're here now, so glad you're safe." Caleb had cried too, his 12-year-old composure crumbling in his grandmother's familiar embrace, in the safety of her small house that smelled like cinnamon and cedar and all the memories of childhood visits before the world had proven itself cruel. "I was so scared, Grandma," he'd whispered. "I thought my leg was going to be broken forever. I thought I'd never walk right again." His grandmother had pulled back to look at him properly, her weathered face showing the kind of strength that came from surviving Jim Crow and raising black children in America and outliving a husband she'd loved for 53 years. "Your leg will heal, baby," she'd said gently. "Bones always do given time, but I need you to know that what happened to you wasn't about your leg, it was about hate, and hate has been breaking black bodies for longer than I've been alive, longer than your granddaddy lived, longer than this country wants to admit." She turned to Destiny then, had cupped the 14-year-old's face in hands that had picked cotton as a child, that had marched for voting rights as a young woman, that had raised children who'd raised children in the persistent hope that maybe each generation would face less hatred than the last. "And you, my brave girl," she'd said, "you protected your brother the best way you knew how, you called for help when it was needed, you did what so many grown folks failed to do that day." The weekend had been healing in small ways, filled with Grandma's cooking and old photo albums and stories about their mother who Caleb barely remembered but Destiny held close to her heart. They talked about the incident when the children were ready, had processed the trauma with the help of someone who understood generational pain, who could contextualize their experience within the larger history of black suffering and resistance. Warren had joined them for Thanksgiving a month later. The whole family gathered around his mother's table, and when she'd raised her glass to toast, she'd looked at her grandbabies with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. "To Caleb and Destiny," she'd said, her voice strong despite her age, "who learned too young that the world can be cruel, but who survived with their spirits intact, and to my son who used his power to demand accountability when so many would have stayed silent." The trial had concluded in February, 9 months after the incident, with Brandt convicted on all charges despite his attorney's attempts to claim the kick had been accidental, that Caleb's movement had been threatening, that use of force had been justified. The jury had watched the security footage, had heard testimony from the nurse and supervisor Williams and 17 passengers who'd witnessed the assault, had seen medical records documenting a 12-year-old's fractured tibia, and had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts. The judge had been a white man in his 60s who'd seen too many cases of authority figures abusing power, who'd grown tired of excuses that prioritized order over humanity. "Mr. Brandt," he'd said during sentencing, "you were entrusted with the safety of travelers including children, and you chose to weaponize that trust against a 12-year-old boy because your racism convinced you he was a threat. You kicked a child hard enough to break his leg and then claimed he was faking. Your actions were deliberate, cruel, and fundamentally incompatible with the responsibility you'd been given." 3 years in federal prison, the judge had pronounced, followed by 5 years supervised release during which you are prohibited from any employment involving authority over minors or security screening. You will also pay restitution for medical expenses and participate in mandatory anti-bias training, though I suspect that ship has long since sailed. Brandt had wept as he'd been led away in handcuffs, his career and pension and reputation all destroyed, but Warren had felt no satisfaction watching it, had felt only exhaustion that it had taken his son's broken leg to trigger consequences that should have come years earlier when the first complaint was filed against this man. 2 months after the trial, Warren had appeared before a congressional subcommittee examining racial bias in airport security procedures, had brought the printed tickets that Brandt had dismissed as fraudulent, had brought medical records documenting Caleb's injury, had brought video footage that members of Congress had watched with expressions ranging from horror to shame. "This isn't an isolated incident," Warren had testified, his voice steady and clear. "This is a pattern of racial profiling that targets black travelers including children, that assumes our tickets are stolen and our presence is suspicious, that treats our bodies as threats to be controlled rather than citizens to be served." He'd submitted documentation of hundreds of similar complaints, had presented data showing that black passengers were 3 times more likely to be subjected to additional screening, had demanded systemic reforms including mandatory anti-bias training, independent oversight of TSA conduct, and consequences for supervisors who ignored patterns of discriminatory behavior. And if you've watched Caleb's story and you're not already subscribed to this channel, if you're not sharing this video with everyone who needs to understand that black children are being brutalized by the very people supposed to protect them, then ask yourself what that says about your priorities. Subscribe right now because stories like this need to reach millions, not thousands, because your engagement creates pressure for change, because Caleb's broken leg and Destiny's trauma and warrants. Fight for justice only matter if enough people care to demand that this never happens again. At home in his bedroom, Caleb kept those tickets framed on his wall above his desk, the boarding passes that Brandt had examined with such contempt now preserved behind glass. They weren't a reminder of the worst day of his young life but proof of something more important, proof that he and Destiny had been telling the truth all along, proof that their tickets were legitimate and their presence was valid and their humanity was real despite what Officer Brandt's racism had tried to erase. Proof that sometimes, not always but sometimes, speaking up and fighting back and refusing to accept injustice could lead to something approaching justice even if it came too late to prevent the breaking.